His wife, Clementine, was tremendously important. On the face of it, a kind of classic male chauvinist pig story that here was a wife who looked after him, who catered for all his needs and all the rest of it. It was a real marriage in certain ways, that because she was married to him, he gave her the chance to be things that she'd never be otherwise. And particularly during the Second World War, she gets this job looking after the aid programs to support Russian hospitals, because the Russians are doing the bulk of the fighting. And she's very concerned about this. She's very struck by it hurts her that we can't open a second front. And she has a chance to go and visit these Russian hospitals, and that makes something for her life.
Churchill, to me, is a one-of-a-kind figure in so many different ways. He was obsessed with greatness. He was a close observer of the people that he dealt with. He had this love affair with his dad, even though his dad perhaps mistreated him as a kid. He had to glorify his father. But this was a man that, and I'll use his own description, he lived in the wilderness for many, many years. Mm-hmm. And this is a metaphor. I've got young listeners that listen to us, sir. They may not know what I mean, but Churchill described his years, the wilderness years, when he was a backbencher and he had lost out at Gallipoli, and he'd lost the Lord of the Admiralty, all these different things that happened to him. Yet he hung in there. He suffered from the black dog, sir, right? The depression that he describes in his life. But here he is getting to the prime ministership at a time when the country actually really needs him. So you've written about 5 or 6 different individuals, perhaps more in this book, alongside of him. But who do you think really shaped him? If you had to look to one person and say, was it Clementine Churchill, his wife? Was it his mom? Was it David Lloyd George? Who shaped him, sir?
Lloyd George was certainly, he was the British leader, prime minister through the worst part of the First World War. Clearly a man who Churchill was always slightly in awe of. But in the end, of course, if you take the longer story and to the Second World War, Lloyd George was by then over the hill. And also he did not have that physical courage that Churchill did. Churchill was unusual in that this was a man who'd been trained as a soldier, who'd fought in battle, who I would imagine had killed people, who'd nearly been killed by others. And he was pretty fearsome. And Lloyd George was a coward. He was scared stiff of the bombing, the German bombing during the Second World War. And it was clear that he didn't have that spirit and fire that Churchill did.
Yeah,
I would say that in certain ways, and I'm perhaps pushing this a little bit because she's been so neglected, his wife, Clementine, was tremendously important.
Yeah, that's the last chapter of your book, which I found
the last chapter of the book. And this was, on the face of it, a kind of classic male chauvinist pig story, that here was a wife who looked after him, who catered for all his needs and all the rest of it. He didn't do anything in the way of domestic chores, absolutely inconceivable. And she said right at the beginning, she realized when she fell in love with him that this was going to be her life's work and it was going to be very costly. And whenever he was away on a wartime trip seeing Roosevelt or Stalin, she went off to a spa, to a rest home, and just recuperated because it was so exhausting.
Yeah.
Yet what's fascinating, and I try to bring this out in the book, was a real marriage in certain ways, that because she was married to him, he gave her the chance to be things that she'd never be otherwise. And particularly during the Second World War, she gets this job looking after the aid programs to support Russian hospitals because the Russians are doing the bulk of the fighting. And she's very concerned about this. She's very struck by it hurts her that we can't open a second front. And she has a chance to go and visit these Russian hospitals, and that makes something for her life. So I was very struck by the way that this was, in interesting ways, a real partnership, and one that I don't think is fully appreciated.